The sound that stays with me is not the prayer or the weeping, but the dull, final thud of soil as it struck the casket. It landed without drama, without mercy, as if the earth itself were tired of holding back. I stood there wrapped in black fabric that felt heavier than winter wool, my hands folded because that was what mothers did when they no longer trusted themselves to move. I was 68 years old enough to know the order of things, old enough to know that this moment was wrong. Grief had already hollowed me out by then. I was running on ritual, not strength. Stand when others stand. Bow your head when the words require it. Breathe in. Breathe out. I remember thinking that if I followed the sequence closely enough, I might survive the day without breaking apart in public. That was when she arrived. Late, deliberate, her heels sinking into the softened ground. My son's wife entered the cemetery with her hand resting on another man's arm. Not a cousin. Not a friend. A man who looked too comfortable beside her. I felt the air change before I heard it. The collective intake of breath, the quiet confusion rippling through the mourners like a warning. No one spoke aloud. That I stared, unable to look away, trying to understand how betrayal could be so casual. She met my eyes, her expression composed. Later, as condolences thinned, she leaned close enough to whisper about moving forward, about what now belonged to her. I nodded because I had no words left. I did not yet know my son had prepared for this moment, or that grief was only the beginning. My son was not the kind of boy who demanded attention. Even as a child, he moved through the world quietly, observing before acting, listening more than he spoke. He lined his toys in careful rows, not out of rigidity, but out of respect for order. When other children argued, he stepped back. When they boasted, he smiled and stayed silent. I learned early that his strength lived beneath the surface. I raised him alone after his father passed, in a small house where nothing was wasted and everything had a place. We did not have much, but we had rules, routines, and a belief that character mattered more than comfort. I worked steadily, saved carefully, and taught him that promises were not decorations. They were commitments. He absorbed those lessons without needing to be reminded. As he grew older, his kindness remained, but it sharpened into something deliberate. He helped neighbors without announcing it. He kept journals, labeled folders, and planned years ahead in ways that surprised me. Emotionally, he was private. He loved deeply, but he did not perform his feelings for an audience. When he brought his future wife home, I saw that reserve softened. In the beginning, she was charming in a bright, energetic way. She spoke easily, laughed loudly, and filled rooms with her presence. My son watched her as if she were a language he was still learning. There were small moments that unsettled me. Her impatience when plans changed, her irritation with boundaries, but I told myself marriage required adjustment. I stayed silent out of respect for his choices. Their life together looked successful from the outside. My son built a steady career, rising without spectacle, trusted by those who valued precision and reliability. He documented everything: contracts, savings, policies, plans for contingencies no one else wanted to imagine. He believed preparation was a form of love. His wife preferred visibility. She liked appearances, recognition, the reassurance of being seen. I noticed the contrast, but I did not interfere. My own life remained modest. I lived within my means, measured success in peace rather than possessions. I believed patience was a form of wisdom. Perhaps that belief kept me from asking harder questions when I should have. I assumed love would compensate for difference. I assumed decency would prevail. When my son fell ill, it happened quietly, as he did everything. He downplayed symptoms, reassured me with practiced calm. Our conversations became careful, polite, unfinished. There were things I wanted to ask, warnings I wanted to voice, but time shortened faster than courage. His death arrived before clarity did, leaving sentences suspended between us, unanswered and irreversible. And the weeks that followed, I replayed our last ordinary moments, searching for signals I had missed. He had been tired, yes, but still attentive, still deliberate. He organized papers even then, straightening stacks, labeling folders, setting things aside with intention. I thought it was habit. I did not understand it was farewell. Knowing who he was, how thoughtfully he lived, only deepened the pain of watching others reduce him to what could be taken from him. That understanding followed me like a shadow as arrangements were made and condolences offered. People spoke of his assets before they spoke of his kindness, of outcomes before intentions. Each comment felt like a small erasure. The steadiness he lived by, the care he invested in unseen details, deserved more than quick conclusions. Remembering the man I raised made it impossible to accept how quickly his life was being summarized. It was this growing imbalance, sharpened by memory and love, that made the events surrounding his death feel not only painful, but profoundly wrong in ways I had not yet found language for or courage to confront. Days after the funeral, the house changed ownership without a single document being signed. My son's wife moved through rooms with purpose, opening drawers, closing doors, making lists I was not invited to see. She spoke on the phone in clipped, confident tones about accounts, policies, and timelines, as if grief were an inconvenience she had already scheduled around. I stayed in the guest room, the one she said would be easiest for me, and told myself that mourning required humility. Her companion did not pretend to stay in the background. He arrived early each morning and left late, wearing familiarity like entitlement. He leaned against counters, flipped through mail, and spoke of renovations and travel plans in the future tense, as though my son had merely stepped out for a moment. When he looked at me, it was with polite impatience, the way one looks at an obstacle that will eventually be removed. Requests began almost immediately. Passwords, keys, documents. She asked for papers I had never seen, then sighed when I could not produce them. Filing cabinets were locked. Closets were reorganized. My son's study, once precise and calm, was sealed with a new knob and an unspoken warning. I was told it was better not to disturb things until everything was settled. I nodded and stepped back. There were moments when humiliation arrived quietly. A request to clear my belongings from a hallway cabinet because space was needed. A reminder that certain rooms were now private. A suggestion that it might be easier for everyone if I stayed with a friend for a while. I felt myself becoming smaller, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Arguing required energy I no longer had. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her of what I suspected. I watched instead. I listened. I noted the speed with which grief had turned into administration, the efficiency with which my son's life was being reduced to line items. When I asked a simple question about a savings account I knew existed, she smiled tightly and said it was being handled. What unsettled me most was not her certainty, but her lack of curiosity. She never wondered aloud what my son might have wanted beyond the obvious. She never hesitated before making decisions on his behalf. It was as if she believed love had been replaced by entitlement, and entitlement required no reflection. In the evenings, when the house finally quieted, I found myself remembering small, unremarkable moments. My son at the kitchen table, sorting papers into neat stacks. My son explaining, almost apologetically, that he preferred to handle paperwork himself. Once, years earlier, I had teased him for being overly careful. He had smiled and said, almost to himself, that some things should be opened only when they were needed. At the time, I thought he was talking about emergencies. Sitting alone now, I wondered if he had been talking about truth. The call from the attorney came less than a week later. A brief, formal message requesting a meeting to review the estate. When I mentioned it, my daughter-in-law waved a hand dismissively. She said everything was straightforward, that there were no surprises left. She spoke with the confidence of someone already counting forward. I agreed to attend and said nothing more. As arrangements were made, I felt a strange stillness settle in me. The legal appointment loomed, unremarkable on the surface, yet heavy with unspoken possibility. I did not yet know what waited there, but I sensed that whatever my son had set aside, he had done so deliberately. The meeting, she believed, would confirm what she already claimed. I began to suspect it would do something else entirely. That realization did not feel like hope. Felt like weight, patient and unmoving. I carried it quietly as days passed, as signatures were anticipated and assumptions hardened. I watched her confidence grow louder, her plans more detailed, her certainty more public. I remained still, not because I was powerless, but because stillness had always been my son's language when he trusted a process. Whatever truth he had prepared was not meant to be argued into existence. It was meant to arrive intact. And so I waited, allowing the noise to exhaust itself, knowing that the meeting ahead was not a formality, but a threshold where restraint would finally be answered. In that silence, memory and patience aligned, preparing me for whatever order would soon be restored quietly. My son never spoke to me about the attorney visits. I learned about them later, through dates on envelopes and the quiet testim. Oni of order. Months before his illness worsened, he had begun meeting with a lawyer in a small office across town, arriving early, leaving without ceremony. He revised documents slowly, thoughtfully, never in haste. Each decision carried weight, not fear. I imagine those meetings often. Him sitting upright, hands folded, asking careful questions. Love had not left his marriage yet, but clarity had entered it. He hoped for repair while preparing for truth. That balance defined him. He did not act from bitterness. He acted from evidence he could no longer ignore. At home, his habits deepened. Filing cabinets were emptied, sorted, refilled with precision. Envelopes were labeled in his steady hand, dates aligned, instructions written plainly. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just facts arranged so they could not be misinterpreted later. I remember him oiling a stubborn drawer one afternoon, muttering about how things failed when neglected. He placed a second key inside an old tin where we once kept sewing needles. I found it months later. It was not hidden, only overlooked, resting where patience would eventually bring it to light. That was his way. He trusted time more than confrontation. What I understand now is that this was not revenge. There was no punishment built into his planning, no desire to embarrass or destroy. It was responsibility exercised quietly. He knew the cost of chaos. He knew grief would make people careless, loud, entitled. He chose to protect order instead of demanding loyalty. As his illness advanced, his movements slowed but his attention sharpened. He double-checked lists. He asked neutral questions. He confirmed signatures. He did not explain himself to me, and I did not press. Parents believe they know their children completely, but adulthood adds rooms we never enter. Still, even from behind closed doors, he was thinking of me, of how I would move through what came next. There were moments I misread as distance, evenings when he seemed preoccupied, tired in a way rest could not fix. I mistook his silence for withdrawal. Only now do I recognize it as focus. He was finishing something. The second file was sealed last. No label, no instructions on the outside, just a thickness that suggested intention. He slid it into place, closed the drawer, and locked it with calm finality. That file was not meant to speak until it was called upon. Returning to the present, I see us all gathering without awareness. We walked into the attorney's office carrying assumptions, grief, and impatience. None of us knew that order had already been restored quietly months before, waiting only for the moment it would be allowed to breathe. That I picture that order now as something physical, like furniture assembled in advance of a storm. It stood firm while emotions rushed past it. My son trusted that structure more than persuasion. He knew arguments collapse under grief, but documents endure. That understanding was not cold. It was compassionate in a way that asked nothing in return. As a parent, I sit with the humility of not having been invited into every decision. I once believed guidance meant proximity, that protection required constant presence. He showed me another version. Love, when mature, works quietly, without applause, without explanation. It builds rails before the fall occurs. When the day of the meeting approached, I sensed his presence not as comfort, but as steadiness. It was there in the measured pace of my steps, in the way my hands no longer trembled when his name was spoken. Others mistook my calm for weakness. I understood it as inheritance. The papers waited, sealed, patient, indifferent to opinion. They did not hurry. They did not defend themselves. They simply existed, complete. That was his final lesson to me. Truth does not require urgency. It requires timing. So when we gathered, each of us carrying our private assumptions, I felt something settle into place. Not hope, not triumph, alignment, the kind that arrives when preparation meets its moment. Whatever was about to be revealed had already been decided long ago, in silence, by a man who understood that dignity survives best when it is planned for and left untouched until it is truly needed. And I walked forward carrying his quiet foresight, unaware that others were about to learn how patience, not force, shapes outcomes when it finally speaks without asking permission now. The attorney's office was smaller than I expected, a neutral room softened by beige walls and a single window that looked out onto nothing memorable. There were no family photographs, no art meant to impress. Just a long table, 3 chairs on each side, and the faint smell of paper and polish. It felt deliberately ordinary, as if designed to strip emotion of spectacle. We sat, hands folded, waiting for procedure to begin. The first file was placed on the table and opened without ceremony. Pages were turned methodically, words read aloud in a steady voice. Counts, property, percentages. Exactly what my daughter-in-law expected. I watched her posture change as confirmation arrived line by line. Her shoulders loosened. She interrupted once, twice, clarifying details she already understood. Her companion leaned back, arms crossed, satisfied. Their future appeared settled, clean, inevitable. She spoke freely then, about renovations, about travel, about how difficult the past weeks had been and how ready she was to move on. She used my son's name casually, as if distance had already softened it. When she mentioned generosity, it was in the tone of someone deciding what could be spared. I kept my eyes on the table, tracing the grain of the wood, reminding myself that dignity did not require performance. The attorney listened, nodded, and continued. When the last page of the first file was turned, he did not close it immediately. Instead, he paused. It was a small interruption, barely noticeable, but it changed the room. He cleared his throat and said there was an additional document to review. A second file. Her smile faltered. Only briefly. She glanced at him, then at her companion, amused rather than concerned. She laughed once, softly, as if expecting a formality. I felt my breath steady, my hands still, my body recognizing something my mind had not yet named. The second file was heavier, placed carefully on the table as if weight mattered. It was opened slowly. Conditions were read. Timelines explained. Provisions clarified. The words arrived calmly, without accusation. Assets placed in trust. Access delayed. Rights defined with precision. Protections established long before illness became undeniable. Each sentence removed an assumption. Each clause restored intent. This was not subtraction. It was structure, quietly assembled. The room grew quieter. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, interrupting again, her voice sharper now, urgency replacing ease. She questioned interpretations, challenged phrasing, suggested misunderstandings. The attorney responded without emotion, referencing signatures, dates, confirmations. Facts did not raise their voices. They did not need to. Her companion spoke next. Louder, indignant. He questioned fairness, motive, legality. He gestured toward me once, as if I were the source of inconvenience. The attorney answered by turning pages, reading verbatim. The paper did the talking. With every response, certainty drained from the room, replaced by something brittle and exposed. I watched the smallest reactions. A foot tapping, then stopping. A jaw tightening. Hands that had been confident now restless. I noticed how the attorney never looked up when voices rose, how neutrality itself became a kind of authority. The room no longer belonged to opinion. It belonged to record. In that moment, I felt my son beside me, not as memory, but as intention. His patience, his insistence on preparation, his belief that order could protect when emotion failed. I understood then that this meeting was not about inheritance. It was about being known correctly, without distortion. I remained silent. Not out of fear, but because nothing required defense. My son's foresight stood intact, unaffected by reaction. He had protected what mattered without punishing anyone. Dignity preserved, not weaponized. The balance of power shifted without spectacle. Like furniture rearranged in the dark while everyone slept. Shock arrived first, then anger. Her face tightened. His confidence evaporated. Silence followed, heavy and unyielding. The attorney continued until there was nothing left to read. No ambiguity remained. Angie. He closed the file with the same care he had opened it. Hand steady, expression neutral. I felt my grief differently then. Still present, still aching, but no longer erasing me. I was seen not through sympathy, but through order. My son had spoken without being there. He had not left chaos behind. He had left clarity, designed to withstand noise and impatience. As we stood, I noticed how quickly certainty collapses when it is built on assumption. Power does not announce its exit. It simply leaves, and the absence is unmistakable. The room seemed larger then, emptier, stripped of illusion and expectation alike. For the first time since the funeral, I felt my spine straighten. Not in defiance, but in recognition. I belonged in that room, in that truth, without permission from anyone present. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped softly. Papers were gathered. No apologies were offered. None were needed. People stood, adjusted coats, avoided eyes. My daughter-in-law left first, heels sharp against the floor, her companion trailing behind, suddenly uncertain. The room emptied gradually, leaving behind the echo of words that could not be taken back. I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle into my bones. Consequences had been set in motion, but there was no triumph in it. Only alignment, the kind that lingers long after voices fade, reshaping what comes next without asking permission or forgiveness. Silence held, steady and complete, as truth settled into place without urgency, argument, or need for validation. Thereafter, after the meeting, her presence thinned quickly. Lawyers replaced phone calls, and messages arrived through formal channels, stripped of tone or warmth. She stopped coming to the house altogether, sending requests instead of appearing herself. Emotionally, she withdrew even faster. There were no explanations offered, no attempts at reconciliation, only distance shaped into procedure. Socially, she vanished from shared spaces, Gath. Airings quietly cancelled, invitations left unanswered, as if retreat might undo what had been spoken aloud. The house responded to the change before I did. Doors reopened, drawers unlocked. I was no longer asked before entering rooms that had once belonged to my son. His study was returned to me without comment, its familiar order intact beneath a thin layer of disruption. I moved slowly, reclaiming space without ceremony. Respect returned not as apology, but as absence of obstruction, and that was enough. What surprised me most was the lack of satisfaction. There was no surge of victory, no relief sharp enough to name. Balance settled instead, steady and unemotional. Justice, I learned, does not always feel like happiness. Sometimes it feels like breathing at a normal depth again after weeks of shallow air. The storm had passed, but it left behind quiet rather than celebration. One evening, alone in the study, I sat where my son used to work and allowed myself a moment I had postponed. I spoke to him softly, not out loud, but with the familiarity of habit. I thanked him, not for what he protected, but for how he protected it. For choosing restraint over confrontation, preparation over drama. His final gift was not security alone, but dignity preserved without cruelty. I did not reach out to her. I did not defend myself to anyone. There was nothing left to prove. I carried his foresight the way one carries a watch set correctly, trusting it without constantly checking the time. The noise that had surrounded his death receded, replaced by routines that no longer felt fragile. Days turned into weeks. Edges softened. Grief found a quieter shape, less sharp, more companionable. Meaning began to surface where shock had once lived. I understood then that what endures is not the moment of revelation, but the calm that follows it. In that calm, my son remained present, not as loss, but as guidance, Steady and complete, I returned to ordinary routines with deliberate care. Cooking, familiar meals, tending the garden, and answering messages when I was ready. People spoke more gently to me now, as if understanding had adjusted their posture. I accepted this without commentary. What mattered was not their change, but my steadiness within it. The future no longer felt like a negotiation. It felt settled, shaped by intention rather than reaction. In the quiet spaces between days, I felt my son's influence guiding my steps, reminding me that preparation is a form of love, and that love, when practiced quietly, continues long after voices fall silent without asking anything in return ever from anyone. Life did not change all at once after that. It settled. Mornings returned to their familiar rhythm, light filtering through the kitchen window at the same hour each day. I resumed walking the same routes, buying the same bread, answering letters without hesitation. Grief did not disappear, but it softened, reshaping itself into remembrance rather than pain. I learned to carry my son with me without feeling crushed by his absence. With time, people stopped asking about the will and started speaking about him instead. Stories replaced speculation. His kindness, his reliability, the way he listened without interrupting. I realized then that legacy is not what survives in accounts or property records. It is what remains consistent in memory when nothing else is being divided. I often think about intention now. My son did not leave behind instructions to punish or reward. He left order. He left clarity. He trusted that truth, when preserved carefully, could outlast noise, urgency, and entitlement. That trust reshaped how I understand love. Love that prepares is not cold. It is considerate. It thinks beyond emotion and chooses endurance over impulse. As I move through my days, I notice how easily people confuse volume with importance. How quickly greed announces itself, demanding recognition. My son chose another path. He allowed dignity to speak only when necessary, airy, and even then without raising its voice. That choice continues to guide me. That I keep his papers where they belong now, untouched. Not because I fear reopening old wounds, but because their purpose has been fulfilled. What mattered has already been said. The rest is silence, and silence, I have learned, can be generous. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not one that needs declaring. It lives in restraint, in preparation, in the quiet confidence that doing what is right does not require an audience. Some measure wealth. I measure it in the calm that remains when everything else falls silent.